are an alternative source of news and media, coming to you live from the Hill Street Solo Theatre in Edinburgh at the Fringe. We're going to be covering a range of discussions and topics today on the referendum upcoming. We are largely organised by yes folk, but we try to have open and frank discussions, which is the whole point. We want to have an informed electorate making a decision in September. Joining me today is broadcaster and author Lesley Riddoch. Please welcome her.
And just in case anyone's thinking, who's that curly-haired devil sitting on the sofa beside you? This is Stephen Paton.
Yeah, I should have
And again, just in case anybody's listening on Twitter, you know what I mean. The hashtag, please tweet away throughout the whole programme, is hashtag RefTV.
Yeah, so we do welcome your thoughts as we go along. So first of all, we're going to have a wee chat about some of the news today. So we have two quite interesting articles. First of all, from The Sun, we have the civil liberty story. So what we're seeing here is accusations against the DWP boss telling staff to back the union. So
this will be as well for those who are going, DWP, what is that animal? It's the Department of Work and Pensions.
Yep.
Chief Civil Servant Devereaux was his name, wasn't it? Who wrote to civil servants. Yeah,
and he sent out an email saying that basically that this is, when asked about which way civil servants should be swinging, he said this is because the UK government has a clear position to maintain the union, and so it's legitimate and necessary for UK civil servants to support the government in this objective, essentially asking for a no vote. And in contrast to that, we also have today accusations that Alex Neil, the Health Secretary, has sent out emails to NHS Scotland saying that staff's pensions would be fully protected after independence. Do you feel there's a wee bit of hypocrisy here of calling out the UK government for doing this and then turning around and doing a similar thing?
Well, there is. I mean, scarcely a day seems to go by without my recalling the phrase "whataboutery," which was coined by a tremendous guy in Northern Ireland, David Irvine, who coined this one, because what would tend to happen over there, and it happens in life everywhere, is that one side will parade some of the kind of hurts or problems they've got, and essentially the other side will kick straight in, but what about? And then the list of whatever they're kind of complaining about, effectively it just appears to then negate the original complaint made. That seems to have been what happened yesterday. This complaint about the letter sent out to civil servants seems to me to be pretty legitimate. I see from the story there in The Sun, actually, that it was also retracted the same day, although some of the other papers are not mentioning that. So it does seem that the civil service accepted that had gone way too far in being effectively an edict. Work for us, think like us. Now that seems to me to be not on. What had happened meanwhile back at the fort with Alex Neil and the Health Service, well, there'd been loads of stuff put out suggesting that actually pensions would be in tatters, whatever. You might argue, and I know people might think this is a bit partial, that it's the role of a responsible employer to reassure people in the wake of loads of stuff coming around that basically the world will, go to hell in a handcart, and your pensions, well, you can forget about them. There seemed to be a sort of reassurance to people that this is a guarantee from the Scottish Government that we will deliver. I don't really think there's an equity in the kind of complaints of fiddling with your workforces in these two stories. But nonetheless, it's interesting too that the Record has that questioning of Alex Neil and the very effectively anti-yes kind of stance, whereas The Sun is continuing to have quite sort of pro-yes-ish almost kind of stances in its editorials, which is interesting.
So you think we might be seeing a yes from The Sun quite soon?
Well, I don't know. But, was it 2007, I think, that they came out for supporting the SNP in that election, to everyone's surprise. So, they could be kind of sitting nursing their wrath to keep it warm, or they could be about to give us a big surprise. I don't know.
Interesting. And also today we've seen a new panel-based poll being published, which has quite interesting results. It's discovered that we're still on 48% intending to vote yes and 52% voting no. But what's interesting is that 58% of those polled thought that the Scottish budget would be cut after a no vote.
Yeah, this was really, and this is not in the papers. In fact, one of the points we wanted to make today is how much, in effect, that might be interesting to people about this referendum is not in the morning papers. Panel-based, however, have just announced this, and that is an interesting one. Of the whole electorate sampled, it was yes, those who believed that there would be a budget cut in the event of a no vote was 58%. Those who thought there wouldn't be a cut was 20%, with the rest don't knows. The SNP were the most likely to think, people who'd previously voted SNP, the most likely to think there'd be a budget cut. 3/4 of SNP supporters thought that. But actually 53% and 52% of Liberal Democrats, 53% of Labour supporters also thought that would happen. So, I mean, that's an interesting one, because there's been a lot of prognostications of what people might think that is gloomy after a yes vote in the last few weeks. But this one's kind of got the boot in the other foot slightly and is saying to people, well, actually, are you confident now, especially in the wake of a poll that occurred earlier this week that we discussed, which suggested that the majority of English voters want to see the Scots, as it were, brought down to a level playing field in terms of public expenditure. So basically, bye-bye Barnett, if the voters had any say in it. That seems to have kind of got people thinking, overall, we're probably going to see a kind of cut in public spending. So I guess that might be working its way through to those headline figures about yes and no, although, as you pointed out, there's no change there from the last panel-based poll. But still, it's pretty good, isn't it? With a 4% difference, that's kind of interesting.
But then you have this strange situation of people who seem to be... There's more people who are voting... Sorry, I'll start that again. People seem to think there's going to be a budget cut, but there's still a higher percentage of people voting no. So it seems to be that a large percentage of those polled are voting no, even though they accept that there might be cuts coming, which is quite interesting.
I suppose you could argue they may think there would be cuts coming in under any circumstances. You know, I mean, to be fair, we're in a situation where people, here we go banting more statistics, but a recent poll found that 68% of Scots don't believe anyone's statistics now. So, only 68%, I hear you cry. So, up to a point, I guess people are looking at promises from both sides, and I don't think people think it'll all be sweetness and light if there's a yes vote, but nor do they think it'll be Armageddon if there's a no vote. I mean, folk are sensible. So somewhere in the middle of it, people are basically taking, having a few question marks about both sides.
It's interesting. And speaking also about things that aren't in the actual papers today, we've had quite an interesting development in social media. This morning, a new hashtag went out called Yes Because. It was launched by National Collective. Basically, hashtag Yes Because, and then explaining your reasons why. And it's really fascinating because it's completely taken off. It's become this massive thing. It took 12 minutes before it was trending across the UK. It took 1 hour before it was trending worldwide. It's expected there's been 6,000 tweets an hour of people saying their yes because. And it's amazing. And so much of this campaign is taking place online and social media. It's just interesting to see that that's kind of reaching this next level of people really starting to tell why they're in this position, why they're voting this way. And this is just another part of that.
And what have you, because I noticed a few before I came in, but I hadn't realised it was part of a big master planning type thing. What are the ones that you've seen? You said there were some quite emotional ones.
There has been a few quite emotional ones. There's people who have been living in poverty, who've been explaining the situation that they've been in, and they're voting yes because they kind of see this as a way of getting out. We saw that with the Radical Independence Campaign's mass canvass recently, where working class areas or areas with high poverty were overwhelmingly yes. And I think the yes because...
to get all that in a tweet. That's pretty good going, actually.
It's just
and what about summary. No because?
No because, yeah, well, quite quickly after that, no because started, but I don't think that quite took off. Last I checked, it was about 120 tweets an hour compared to the 6,000. So, I mean, they're trying to keep up, so that's nice.
Well, early days. And I think there's been some other stuff going on in the papers, hasn't there? Some of the same old, actually.
Yes, much of the same stuff we've been seeing, repeating quite a lot recently. So we're going to have a wee chat now about oil and currency. But for that, we're going to bring on Alex Masson. So Alex is a journalist and a blogger for The Spectator. Please welcome him onto the set. Thanks for joining us.
Delighted.
Well, Alex, feels like it's been a whole 2 days since I have been speaking to you about something.
Well, I know, but I hadn't realised the sort of contractual obligation that if you're doing a thing, I have to do a thing, and vice versa.
I know, it's weird, isn't it?
To Referendum TV as well as the BBC.
It's a strange old one. But anyway, so we actually are about to plough on with some of the, the headlines that have been dominating the papers have been to do with the oil again. Is there an awful lot of it or is there not? And the question then about the Adam Smith Institute's support for a sort of sterlingisation type plan B. But just on before we move on to that, on what we've been talking about already. Have you got thoughts on the stories that we've been covering already?
Well, the yes because thing is quite fun, isn't it? I mean, there are quite a lot of people taking the mickey out of it and so on. I saw one tweet saying, you know, I'm voting yes because no one will publish my novel. No, it wasn't me. But you know, I'm not sure that these things should be taken terribly seriously, but they're an entertainment, and obviously they cheer up people who are already persuaded of the merits of voting yes. I'm not sure that it does much to actually change anyone's mind, but then that is true of most things in the campaign, frankly.
But just at a technical level, can you actually end up trending around the world by simply being retweeted by existing yes followers? I look at Stephen merely because he seems to know what he's talking about on this stuff.
It's certainly easier to trend around the world as a UK-based thing before the United States has woken up. You know, that's certainly true.
Cynic.
Yeah.
Well, is that true?
I'm not a massive Twitter guy,
Oh,
although I do
okay.
use it. But
Right, is that still last season already for
yeah,
your
we're moving on to the next thing.
Okay.
Whatever it
But
is.
I mean, and the other thing, of course, you were talking about and so on about you know, public spending cuts after the next election, regardless if it's a yes or a no vote. I mean, there is going to be a squeeze on public spending, whether Scotland is independent or not. The Barnett formula should be looked at again. You know, it's a 40-year-old sticking plaster. That was an update of the Goshen formula that was introduced in 1888. So I think reappraising UK, the division of UK funds is long overdue, actually, and a renewed needs-based approach rather than necessarily a pure population-based approach would seem to be perfectly sensible and also actually equitable. And that might well put a squeeze on Scottish public spending. But, of course, in the event of a no vote, you know, the Scottish Parliament will have additional tax-raising powers, and so any Scottish government will be in a place, if it seeks to do so, to test the much-loved hypothesis that the Scottish people yearn to pay higher taxes than they do at present.
Well, I could be cruel and ask you which particular tax-raising powers we're talking about today, but you know there's one difficulty there.
Well,
but
the current Scotland Act brings in the power to some income tax proposals and so on. So
yes,
those
that's
exist already.
That's largely a substitution effect. That allows the Scots to be able to raise some money here and then see a cut in the block grant. So effectively, that's bill, not really.
If the Conservatives win the next
Alex,
election, then
in the interest of just having a conversation, I was only trying to pick up your point because I mean I do take your point that we have yet to prove that the Scots are very keen to pay lots of tax. But I wouldn't be all that keen to pay much more tax if a lot of it was effectively maintaining a current arrangement where some of my taxes end up paying for Trident, for example.
But that's why I mean, to ignore the Trident bit because I don't think that's hugely relevant. But that's one reason. It's not. That's one reason why, in the event of a no vote, actually, yes supporters should hope that the Conservatives win the next UK election, because there's a much better chance of getting a proper Scotland bill from a Conservative-led government than from a Labour-led government, because the Tories actually believe in this stuff, whereas Labour don't really have a clue, particularly in Scotland, what they believe in.
Well, it's strange how that's actually become apparent. Yeah. But nonetheless, if you're talking for the whole of Better Together, as yes has often had to speak for everybody.
I'm not talking for
I should actually say that. You're talking for you, who writes for the Spectator.
My prejudice. I mean, I write for my own prejudices and nobody else's.
Yes, I'm trying to say that the Better Together side has got a weakness in that sense, that you can't, in the same way that the Yes campaign and the SNP have often been seen as just identicates, and that one has ended up having to defend all sorts of points of view. It does seem a little bit of a weak point that we still have not got a precise thing to aim at. Where here we are, 3 weeks, 4 weeks to go, in fact, precisely 4 weeks to go today. We still don't have a precise offer for what you get if you vote no.
Well, I mean, you do if you... the Conservatives have been quite clear on this. It is not the Conservatives' fault that the Labour Party hasn't a clue. And the Conservatives can't sort of bully the Labour Party into having a clue. But, as I say, that's why in the event of a no vote, despite the virulent anti-Conservatism that has dominated the Yes campaign, actually nationalists should hope to see David Cameron returned to Downing Street, not Ed Miliband.
Right. For some reason there is actually a David Cameron who runs a Yes cafe in the Royal Mile, so I think we should do a little shout out to him there. We're not meaning you. Other stories, I think, oil and so on.
I was actually quite curious to talk a little bit about something else. If you're talking about the impact on Scotland in terms of new powers but also cuts, if we are seeing a massive pressure from people across England to cut spending in Scotland, and we also have Priti Patel being brought up in the cabinet reshuffle, who's outspokenly said that she wants to slash funding in Scotland, don't you think there'll be a knock-on effect where we will start to see services being cut? I mean, we still have free prescriptions, we still have free dental. Is that likely to go?
Only if the Scottish Government decides that they want to end these things.
But don't you think that with the cut to funding that's something that they may not actually have a choice about at all?
No, there are always choices. There are always choices as to what you fund. I mean, it seems to me that lots of those things should go. I don't actually see the point in subsidising the middle classes at the expense of poorer Scots. I don't see that as being a morally worthwhile or virtuous thing. But then, I'm not in the Scottish Government, and they do see this in those terms in the same ways.
They did actually get elected on a platform of doing it. I mean, I would agree with you sometimes on that. But nonetheless, they get elected on platforms pretty overwhelmingly. I mean, they broke the system.
Yeah, I know. I mean, astonishingly, promise people goodies, and people will vote for you. I mean,
so
who knew?
People are stupid. Ish.
Well, people vote out of their self-interest. I mean, of course, if somebody's offering you X, Y, or Z, and so on, and you'd like it, even if you think that actually you don't really have a great moral claim to it. I don't blame people for voting for that. But I think that the notion that will be, that a Scottish Government would be forced to give up these things and so on, I think is by some sort of nasty government in London, I think is a distortion of the fact that there are always choices to be made. I mean, the Scottish Parliament controls roughly about 60% of spending in Scotland, and how that is apportioned is obviously a choice for ministers. And those choices are not dictated by a chancellor in London. The overall parameters of the budget obviously reflect a London influence, as of course they would after independence too, particularly if there is a currency union, as the First Minister insists there will be, because in those circumstances the level of debt that a Scottish Government can take on, the level of borrowing, will be largely determined by the parameters of a currency union, and those parameters will be quite strict. A Scottish Government will not have nearly as much independent freedom to manoeuvre its fiscal position after independence if there's a currency union, as many people like to think.
Well, sure, and I think this sort of shared sovereignty idea is one that people have slowly been adjusting to as the kind of independence you probably would get in our situation in this kind of world. But just, coming back to the points you were making about Barnett formulas, for example, maybe being fairer to be scrapped. I mean, we'd probably agree that in an ideal world, way back before all of this, it might have been fairer to have a federal Britain, but that's not a flyer either. You need everybody to be believing in something called fairness in these islands before you could start to feel confident that if you let go of the Barnett formula, you would end up with something fair. And I think the problem is that, all the statistics again show that the Scots rampantly don't trust Westminster as far as they can throw it on these questions of fairness and equity within the UK, not just for Scots, but like the north of England or whatever. It looks like a government intent on super-serving the South East.
No, it doesn't, because public spending per head of population is actually lowest in the South East of England. That's the part of the UK which actually receives the lowest levels of public spending.
On
no, I'm not. What I'm suggesting. Outside of London, the southeast of England actually receives much less in the way per capita
London and the
public
southeast,
spending.
I think we want to say.
Well, okay, but it seems to me, the SNP, after all, are the ones who believe in redistribution in some ways. And if Scotland is as wealthy as the nationalists say, and in many ways that is the case, then sure, while you're within the United Kingdom and so on, there is an argument that just as taxes paid in London are not all spent in London, so those parts of the country with a surplus would be expected to transfer some of that surplus to those parts of the United Kingdom that don't generate a surplus, Wales, Northern England, and so on. So because otherwise, the logic of the argument is that Aberdeen and Edinburgh after independence shouldn't transfer surpluses to Lanarkshire and Dundee.
I'm not really arguing about that. I'm saying, do you think Scots trust David Cameron to be the arbiter of fairness in this?
Well, probably not, but that seems to be fairly irrelevant.
Do you, actually?
I think a needs-based approach to public spending, and it should be said that actually, of course, David Cameron is on record as saying that the Barnett formula will not be re-examined after the next election.
Right.
No, okay. Well, you say you don't believe him,
but I'll stick to the question. Do you think David Cameron would, with all the pressure on him politically, with the fact that the vast majority of his votes don't come from this country, would he really be the one that would introduce what the Scots would regard as equity in public spending after the election?
Well, I think that what the Scots would regard as equity and so on is more money for Scotland, and whether that satisfies, if you like, a more dispassionate definition of equity is something that's extremely debatable.
Right. But not now. We could debate this for much, much longer, but sadly we've run out of time. But thanks very much indeed to Alex.
Thank you. Delighted, anytime.
Now we have a sort of sofa shuffle here, which is common on this prog, as Alex shuffles off to do one of his many columns. Indeed, I should have probably introduced him as, well, he writes for The Spectator. In fact, we haven't got the long list of people that he writes for, but he writes for a lot of people. Let's bring in our next two guests. They're both connected to Women for Independence, Susan Stewart and Selma Rahman. Now, come on to our bouncy sofa, gals.
Isn't it? Whether I'll get up from this.
There's always that fear. Susan, you were one of the co-founders of Women for Independence. So, what? Take us back to that wee moment. What made you go for that? It seems a long time ago.
It was a long time ago. I was working out last night. It's 28 months ago. We predate official Yes Scotland, and I think most of the groups. I think we're probably the oldest Yes group in terms of length, not membership. And I think a group of us, it was clear we were going to have a referendum, and a group of women, some of whom had been involved in politics, but very different political perspectives, were all supportive of a yes vote. We thought it would be best for women in Scotland, but perhaps more critically, we wanted a debate where women's voices were heard. We did not want this to be politics as usual, and we thought it was an opportunity for women to become more engaged with the political process.
So can I just ask you, were you formed, and I should remember this, but it's all a blur, were you formed before the official Yes launch or after it?
Long before. It was the first week of April, 2012.
So were you as aghast as many of us were when you saw that there wasn't actually a female speaker on that lineup?
I personally thought that was very problematic and sent the wrong signals, and I think for many of us in Women for Independence it confirmed the necessity of our organisation. We hadn't necessarily anticipated just how male-dominated both official campaigns would turn out to be, but we were determined that it wouldn't be politics as usual. The Scottish Parliament, as you remember, in 1999 had the third highest proportion of women of any legislature in the world, which was wonderful, and it's gone downhill every subsequent election, which is less wonderful.
Do you think that almost the Yes camp has learned from their original mistakes? Because obviously they brought Nicola Sturgeon up. She's very prominent in the campaign just now. She's touring a lot more.
I wouldn't want to say it was necessarily a mistake. These things happen, but the perception was unfortunate. Obviously Nicola Sturgeon is Deputy First Minister. It's their white paper. I would expect Nicola to be playing a prominent role in the SNP's part of the Yes campaign, and the SNP are only part of the campaign. For sure, I think both campaigns are running after the women's vote. We know that more women are undecided. And yes, we would say that more women who are currently voting no are probably softer no votes. If you look at the 1 to 10 scale, they're probably 5 or 6s. So I think both campaigns are chasing the women's vote. I'd argue that Women for Independence is doing so most successfully.
Because there was the Sunday Herald that obviously wrote the whole thing of the NHS is the key to the women's vote. Do you think it's fair to generalise that all women would just, this is a single issue that they would just...
Well, let's bring Selma in here.
Yeah. I'd agree with a lot of what's just been said, but if I go back to your previous guest, an awful lot of the women out there that are voting yes would take great exception to the notion that if you're voting yes, you're a nationalist. Now that is something that's also coming across when you've got the different parties and the perspectives that are coming forward. But if you take the notion of the NHS and then you expand that into public services and social care and social services, there's a big difference between women here, women in Scotland, and the rest of the United Kingdom. I heard Jim Murphy last night trying to diss everybody on this. The whole point is that if you take that, it's central to how we address and how we consider fair deal for women, fair deal for families, fair deal for communities. And in the rest of the United Kingdom, the NHS social services are being cut back, they're being slashed, they're being privatised. And women, especially in Scotland, and Scotland in general, don't want to see that happening. And that's why NHS, social services, public services are so core to what women are talking about and influencing their vote.
Just on the vein of I can see an awful lot of that. But, I mean, a lot of people will still say, well, actually on childcare, if you get back to the number of hours and everything, we're not really doing too well just at the moment in Scotland. And that, there are, when we come back to that question about the NHS, in fact, even if the English decided to privatise the whole shebang, as long as they paid for it out of public spending, we'd still get our proportion of the cash, unless, of course, we lose the Barnett formula. But, are you finding people saying, well, I'm not too sure that I can absolutely agree with that as kind of, a likely scenario that we are the upholders of a free point of use welfare service?
Can I come in on that, Lesley? I think that women increasingly are alive to the risks of a no vote. And I think as people understand consequentials and that 10% of whatever Westminster spend in public services constitutes the Scottish grant, then they are aware of the risks. If you look at, for example, childcare or our health service, yes, for sure, those are areas which are devolved to the Scottish Parliament, and there's an element of consensus across all parties in terms of the future direction of these, but we don't control the budget. We're fiddling about at the edges. Unless we control tax revenue and macroeconomic policy, we're only really ameliorating the kind of policies that are obtaining in Westminster at the minute. So I think we need to go the full hog and complete the Home Rule journey.
Absolutely. Again, you can talk to women, as we're doing when we're chatting on the doors, we're standing on street corners, this, that and the next thing, and you will come across folk who'll say to begin with, oh, I don't do politics, it's nothing to do with me. Then you go, what about the politics of your purse? You start talking about what's in your purse, what's not in your purse, and you get to the nitty-gritty of not controlling a budget. Women understand that. There's no problem with that. You start explaining or discussing or entering into that discussion about not controlling the budget that is within Scotland.
How does not controlling which currency is in the budget in your purse work? Because that seems to be, I mean, mercifully we didn't get onto it today because it is, otherwise it could dominate every single, well that's the point. We actually often have a quite spirited debate within the team here as to how important it should be, because every day you could discuss the finer detail of the latest not really very different prognostications. But what do women say on the doorstep about the currency?
It doesn't come up.
Doesn't come up to the extent.
Approaching them with a yes badge?
No. Definitely not.
How do you know?
Because, for example, okay, she worked with Standard Life. I won't tell you who she was, but she worked with Standard Life. And the first thing she says, well, I can't vote yes because they've told me they're going down to the south of England, this, that, and the next thing. That's when other women will start engaging in that question of the currency. But are you telling me that if you and I were in negotiations about something, about buying a house or whatever, we'd put all our cards out on the table right at the very beginning? Definitely not. And that's what's happening at the moment. This is a negotiation strategy that we're not stupid enough to fall for. Because apart from anything else, I open up my purse, I take out £1, £1, well, Edinburgh at the moment, £2.50 for a cup of coffee, right? Right?
That's cheap.
That's cheap, right?
Where's your coffee?
I take out that money, I'm handing over a currency, I'm trading, and I'm getting something back. A currency is just a unit, that's all it is. And are you telling me on the 19th of September, England's going to go, whoa, we don't want your money?
And I mean, what we saw in the poll at the weekend, of course, was that a majority of voters, including those voting no, don't believe the currency bluff.
Exactly.
They know it's a negotiation tactic.
So we had Joseph Stiglitz as well, a Nobel Prize-winning economist, come out and say that it was all bluster and that there would be a union.
But here we are again talking about that aspect of things that we think has been over-talked about. I wanted to ask you, as the first dedicated diplomat in the British Embassy in Washington way back when, Susan, what about the kind of lineup, the sort of sudden eruption of world leaders who spontaneously decided they needed to say that it would be a bad idea for Scots to vote yes.
I think with some of them I might take issue with the word spontaneously, Lesley.
Yeah,
indeed, you were doing that. For sure, I anticipated that would happen. I actually thought that the occasion of the Commonwealth Games and lots of Commonwealth leaders being in Scotland at the time, we might see more of it. I think what world leaders say now, who are used to being in negotiations with a particular geopolitical entity, which is the UK government and the Prime Minister, what they say now compared to what they say post a yes vote on the 18th will be very different. And I have to say there is an enormous amount of international goodwill towards Scotland, as well as recognition of our many strengths, not least in higher education.
And where did the Australian outburst come from?
God knows. I did get, I'm sure we all got emails from friends in Australia saying, really sorry.
Yes.
We didn't vote for him.
That was the catch-all. We didn't vote for him, honest, I promise you, Selma. No, we didn't vote for him.
So what is the thing then, as you're going around, and I mean, it takes a lot of stamina, all this, doesn't it? I mean, I don't know if you've got a house in chaos and a car that looks like a rubbish bin. How are you managing it?
With a very good partner who's very, very helpful and does so much more of the housework and this, that and the next thing, and grown-up children who...
That's a great thing. You've got a partner.
And grandchildren that are beginning to say, where's Granny, and things like that. No, but I mean, to go back to this business about what other politicians are saying, what I'm hoping for, I used to belong to the Labour Party, now resigned from the Labour Party. The death of the Labour Party in Scotland, they just don't know what to do with the corpses.
When did you resign, as a matter of interest?
Not that long ago, to be very honest with you, just months ago, to be totally honest with you.
What was the last straw then? Or did it just take you a bit of time to get round to it?
Absolutely, because my mother, my father, my parents, my grandparents, they've all been Labour Party all their lives, they were, and I was as well. And I just, I mean, as I say, the Labour Party has lost touch with its roots, its constituents here in Scotland. It's absolutely appalling. Chaka Umar, you're talking about Twitter. Chaka Umar this morning has said we need a long-term strategy to address the cost of living crisis. What the has the Labour Party been doing for the years it was in power? Did it address poverty? Did it address the issues that women are now actually talking about? This whole energising of women coming forward and being engaged in this is a liberation process. It's not a single issue. And we've got women who are now talking about economics, who are talking about education, who are involved in this in a way 5 years ago they weren't. You know, politics, it's not for me, I don't do politics.
And yet, you see those polls still stubbornly, I mean, the gender gap seems to be shrinking in some polls. You probably have been studying them more carefully overall, Susan, than myself.
Yeah. I mean, I think undoubtedly that there is a gender gap. It has reduced over the last 2 years. The swing amongst women has been 8% towards yes. I think women generally have taken longer to make up their minds. They're weighing evidence. I think this last month is critical. I am fairly confident, and actually I was doing an interview the other day with a woman from Better Together, and I put a fiver on with her that the gender gap will be
a whole fiver.
A whole fiver. Hey, times are tough. I'm volunteering doing this, and I think that more and more women are, as I say, looking at the risks of a no vote and actually often talking themselves round. I was reading a Facebook status from a yes campaigner last night, Anne McLaughlin, and she's saying she was, in a conversation with a woman who said she was a definite no, and then the woman kept talking about, but I'm worried about, and I think if, and actually had convinced herself by the end of the conversation without Anne saying terribly much at all. So
what do you think, casting forward to the next debate with Alex Salmond? I mean, I know, to a degree, we've aired several times that there is a terrible predisposition of the press and the media to cast this as two big men, basically punching it all out. But it was interesting after the last one, which many people thought Alex had lost, to put it bluntly, that actually in some of the groups, particularly women, there seemed to have been perhaps even the vulnerability or the insistence on trying to talk at least about things other than currency. That did seem to reach somehow a lot of women. What do you reckon this time round he should be up to, and how did that work last time?
Well, I got it wrong last time. I watched it as a political anorak, and immediately after the debate I thought, ooh, that wasn't great. and then began to speak to some undecideds. Then we saw the polls, and undoubtedly it was beneficial for yes. I think this time round, I don't know that I would dare to offer Alex Salmond advice. I think that he should, and I hope that the interviewer does, actually press Alistair Darling on the reality of no powers, given the smorgasbord of maybes, ayes, buts, da-da-da-da-da, and the fact that the Labour Party are totally split on it. I don't expect him to come out with a plan B on the currency. He's been quite clear on the negotiating position. And I hope
What about the things you've been talking about, you know, issues about poverty and the NHS, these sorts of things? Do you think he'll move into that wider area? Because after all, the NHS has been pumped up for the last week.
Definitely NHS. And I wonder from both campaigns, actually, I've anticipated, certainly from the no side, some kind of September surprise from Westminster, whether that's a carrot, whether it's a carrot or a stick. You know, we've had a bit of both throughout the past 2 years.
Promises of more money suddenly flowing into Glasgow.
We're bound to have something, and who knows, maybe the Scottish Government.
But I mean, we're not a nation in numpties. I mean, come on, all these bribes that have been put forward, all these pledges. We know that a pledge has to go from a pledge into a manifesto. You've got to win an election. You've got to move something from your manifesto, not all of it, from your manifesto into your political agenda in Westminster. Let's not talk about the failed promises. Let's not talk about the failed promises to the students. We're not a bunch of numpties. We're not a nation of numpties. We know that promises are just promises.
I'm quite interested in you're talking about earlier on about these like conversations happening everywhere, and one of the kind of defining things about the referendum debate is people are getting involved in politics that they never have before, right?
Fantastic.
And it's really interesting what you're saying about Scotland's the Scottish Parliament having a higher percentage of women than any other, and obviously in 99, yeah. But even now, it's obviously still the higher proportion than Westminster.
Oh yes.
Do you think that a yes vote is going to kind of stimulate women to get back into politics, or getting more women into politics?
I can say on behalf of Women for Independence that if, as I believe that it will be, a yes vote, we will continue as an organisation, and we will certainly want to be involved and to ensure that women throughout Scotland are involved in the drafting of any constitution. I think Women for Independence, like many other groups on the yes side, we're not going back into the private sphere. I also think that an independent Scotland legislature would be more welcoming and attractive to women, because they know about the importance of budgeting and having both sides of the coin.
Is Women for Independence potentially a muscly power group, a broker, or even a women's party?
We're terribly democratic and we work by consensus, so I really can't bounce everyone in Women for Independence into that here, Lesley, although you'd get a newsline. I mean, I note that many, indeed your book talks about it, many small European countries do have a women's party.
Well, actually, some of the most influential, like the Swedes, threatened to have a women's party unless the conventional parties introduced quotas. That's how Sweden had its revolutionary change, and in the end, they didn't set up the women's party because they didn't need to.
Maybe we could fulfil that role as a gender watchdog.
Muscle is a tremendous thing in life.
Right.
But a yes vote will definitely change the political landscape. Apart from anything else, people like me that don't belong to a political party, on the 19th, on that morning, I want to know how all these political parties are going to start wooing people like me.
This is a very good point.
What are they actually going to do? Scottish Labour? My old home? What's going to happen? More independents standing, more women coming forward as independents. And as far as I know, we've never had a man stand as an independent in Scotland, have we?
We had, well, not as an independent, but with the Pensioners' Party.
The Pensioners' Party, but not.
And we've got John Finney, who's an independent at the moment, but he's stepped out of the SNP.
And was John McCallion not an independent briefly?
You see, here we go. But anyway, there's plenty of surprises ahead, quite evidently. We can no doubt have great fun picking over the aftermath, which we hope will be the aftermath of a yes vote.
Absolutely.
And thank you very much.
Will be.
Thanks very
for your
much.
effort.
Thank you.
Okay, and next on to the set, we'd like to welcome Richard Walker, the editor of the Sunday Herald. So please welcome Richard.
Hi, Richard.
How are you doing?
Well, the man in black.
Indeed.
So can you tell us a wee bit about the decision of the Sunday Herald to come out for a yes?
Well, we'd been thinking about it for a while. Even before we sort of made our declaration, the paper had been pretty obviously moving in that direction for over a year. we weren't going to change our minds. We were pretty set on what we wanted as an outcome of the referendum. And once that became apparent, it was fairly clear that it's the honest thing to do is to say that. And also, when you look at the media landscape, the number of newspapers which are either very much against independence or on the fence stroke very much against independence, it seemed a real deficit that there wasn't at least one voice in there that was supporting independence. So given that that's what we believed to be the right outcome, I was very happy to be that voice. Still am.
We were having a wee chat earlier on actually about if we thought there was going to be more papers coming out for independence. Do you think that's likely?
Absolutely no idea. I mean, I don't talk to other editors about whether or not they're going to do that. I don't even know the pressures on them to come out one way or the other. I guess in some newspapers their proprietor will have a view and will decide whether or not they're going to take a stance. And in my case, I'm lucky. My proprietor doesn't do that. I was able to take that decision by myself. Having said that, if it had all gone terribly wrong, or if it goes all terribly wrong in future, he's going to come to me and say, well, that wasn't a very smart move, and perhaps you might be thinking about moving to pastures new. And that's fine with me.
How does that work within the Herald stable? Because you do share an awful lot of operations, do you, with the daily paper?
We share some. It's a really complicated and Byzantine way of working, so it would bore you, Bridget, for me to explain it all. The basic thing is we've got separate editors. We've got some people who work 90% of their time for the Sunday and some people who work 90% of the time for the Herald. So we are separate papers. We've got a separate philosophy. When the Sunday Herald started, it was really very far from the Herald. I think they've maybe come a wee bit closer recently in some respects, not on independence, in terms of we've taken a stance and they haven't. There's some cynicism, I guess, about why we did it, and there's been some suggestion on Twitter in some areas that as a company we took a stance that the Sunday Herald would support independence and the Herald would not, and therefore we would get support or stroke money.
The best of both worlds. I think it's a slogan someone's using.
I get that's not a slogan I would use. However, to be honest, I mean, if you knew the people involved, the notion of getting these people in a room and telling them what way they were going to, I mean, honestly, it's laughable. Even getting the Sunday Herald people in a room and get them to decide what day it is.
Cats.
Yeah, you don't want to be trying that.
Yes, but just on that question of how you go about choosing stories then, because at the beginning there was that sort of taunt that you would be basically, as indeed Referendum TV will get some of the same, is that this is just sort of Pravda of the airwaves for the SNP.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's weird that somehow newspapers are not supposed to take a view on, well, pretty much just this. I mean, newspapers have a leader column. Every week we pass our comment on the events of the previous week. Clearly newspapers are expected to take a view on those things, and also on other things from, in history and in the abolition of slavery, votes for women, in more recent history, the devolution campaigns, where both the Herald and the Scotsman were very active in promoting devolution for Scotland. And nobody said then that this was somehow debasing their journalism. The Sunday Herald has taken views on the Section 28 debate, which started very early in our life, and we were very much in favour of stopping any restriction on discussing gay marriage. I'm very proud to be so, and we were very much opposed to the war in Iraq and devoted acres of newsprint to the reasons why it would be a disaster. And nobody said then your journalism is debased, but now somehow you can't trust a word we say because we happen to believe that independence is the best outcome in the referendum. I mean, it's nonsense. It's nonsense.
And do you think, just on this idea of papers taking a stance, that there is almost like that not everyone understands that? Like a lot of people are reading papers and they don't necessarily get that papers can be biased towards a particular viewpoint.
There's a distinction to be made, and I would make it in terms of what we're committed to. We've got two big commitments, I think, in the Sunday Herald. We've got a commitment to, currently, we've got a commitment to supporting independence. We absolutely believe, or I absolutely believe, that independence is the best outcome in the referendum. But we've also got a commitment to journalism, and we absolutely believe that journalism can be a force for good. It can be a passionate argument for outcomes that you desire and for social change, but it also needs to be biased and it needs to tell the truth. And we go out and we take great pains to tell the truth. We and to have bias, although many people believe that's impossible. We've got a in the hot seat column where we interview someone from yes and we interview someone from no. And many people in the yes camp think we give their people or the yes people a much harder time. And you know what, sometimes I read them and I think that's probably true. But that's our job. Our job is to ask people hard questions. Our job isn't to say to the yes people, here, you know, isn't independence brilliant? Don't you agree? I mean, that's not going to change minds. It's not going to foster debate. So yeah, maybe we do give them a harder time. I have to say that in the hot seat column, I think the yes people tend to emerge as more interesting personalities because of some of the quirks of the people involved. They're very interesting people, and I'm not sure you can always say that about no people.
But my question would be more that outside of the Sunday Herald, there's some papers that are very obviously pro-union, and do you think there's a case that all people don't necessarily understand that they're allowed to be? That they're maybe reading it as this is the case.
I think yes, some people do that. People look for their unbiasedness. They look for impartiality. They say it's a really difficult thing to define. You know, what's impartial? It's very hard. I know there have been academics that have looked at the BBC output and have tried to measure impartiality. It's very difficult to do that. And also I don't like to use the word a misunderstanding of journalism, although as if journalists are the only people that have got this knowledge of what journalism is, and the people who actually consume it know nothing. I mean, that's nonsense. But nevertheless, if you report something, if you report George Osborne saying there's going to be no currency union as a newspaper, that doesn't mean to say you believe that he's not bluffing, or that you believe he'll do that, or indeed that you believe there should be no currency union. It's important that people know what politicians say. You have to have some distinction between your news reports, which should be fact-based, and this is what happened, and your calmness and your opinion, which should be, in my view, saying, this politician says X. Is that really the right? Is he right to say that?
Can I ask you about that? Because I was thinking that you've now got a task that was a much, much bigger version of the wee task that I had when I was editing the Scotswoman way back when.
Yeah,
because, you know, women don't make news. So you end up having to actually try to find different sorts of stories to tell, which nonetheless conform to the idea of news, and that they're significant or unusual and important.
Absolutely.
So you're trying to find things that are perhaps different than what everybody else would be chasing around the news agenda. Yeah. And I wonder sometimes if we don't all have a terribly slavish need to keep reporting what great men think about small things as a feature of news. Like this morning, for example, we heard that John Major regretted the passing of Albert Reynolds in Ireland, you know, who was involved with the peace process there. For Scots, does it really matter an awful lot what John Major thinks about very much, to be really honest?
No, it doesn't.
So
Absolutely
why
not.
do we report it?
I think there's possibly because it's an interesting concept, possibly because it'll spark debate about the peace process in Ireland, and I think those concepts are interesting. I think sometimes it's not so much who says it, although sometimes it is, but it's not always about who says it. It's about what they're talking about, whether that topic is something that people are interested in and that people will talk about and will therefore have a kind of a greater resonance outside the newspaper itself.
But I mean, a lot of it's about news values, because I noticed today in the Record, after the story that they had where they were criticising Alex Neil about his letter to the NHS, there was a piece at the bottom which we'll be exploring more tomorrow about poverty, about demonstrating that I think that in fact I wish I could find it quickly, but I won't even try to search for it in that pile, that the number of people living in poverty in Scotland, I can't remember what it was, it seemed to me it quadrupled over the last 20 years.
Why is that at the bottom of the page?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, when you come to decide what prominence to give a particular story, there are so many factors. Well, you'll know there are so many factors involved in that. Some of them will be your own beliefs, some of them will be your own political beliefs, your own knowledge of certain situations, but then also what are people interested in, what will get people talking. And sometimes you make the right call, and sometimes you make the wrong call. In newspapers, you have to act very quickly. You've got to get the stuff out very quickly. Even now, you've got to get it online really quickly. So I'm not saying that every newspaper makes the right call every time. I mean, quite a lot of newspapers make the right call quite a lot of the time, and I think that's a good thing.
Using having different values, if you're looking at an
do we have different values?
You would look.
We would.
Kind of stories.
One of the things about the campaign is that not so much about covering the stories, but what promise to give the stories. And I think there's something odd when so many newspapers will give great prominence to Better Together stories, and when Alex Salmond and Nicola Sturgeon say something, it's, well, they would say that, wouldn't they? So let's put that on page 10 or on the politics page on page 7. I think that's odd. And I think there's a kind of consensus that emerges in the press pack or among Scottish newspapers. I don't like consensus. I don't think it's helpful. And it would be much better, I believe, if people looked and said, well, that's a consensus, let's say something entirely different.
So you're a disruptive agent.
I hope so.
Still disruptive after all these years.
Indeed, yeah, surely not so many years.
Yes, no, we did work together many years ago with the Scotsman in the past.
We did.
But Sunday Herald this weekend, for example, you are coming the day before a rather important debate.
Indeed.
Alex's and Alistair Darling back in the gladiatorial ring.
Indeed.
I suppose you wouldn't be telling us now what you're going to be looking at on Sunday, but
Yeah.
is that
You
where
know
you're
what?
focusing?
If I ever knew on a Thursday what we'll be looking at on the Sunday, that would be a strange week. Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, I'll tell you 5 o'clock on Saturday probably. We will be looking at that, and we'll be looking at a whole bunch of other things. It's difficult to know. I mean, clearly we did the NHS stuff at the weekend, and the NHS has emerged as a very key issue for this, and the SNP put a lot of store by that in the hope that it will sway some voters, and I think they're probably right to do so.
Was that a leak to you, or if you like, from the SNP?
No, it was the sheer effort of our journalists to get those stories, because they dig at the coalface of truth.
What a boy! And digging away at the cool face of truth in a kind of more banal way, is it paying good money for you? I mean, is the Sunday Herald washing? No. Is the Sunday Herald washing its face?
The Sunday Herald has had a very arduous time since it started in many ways. We started among great enthusiasm, and we still keep that enthusiasm, and actually we still keep that optimism. But clearly the newspaper business is undergoing major changes. We could talk forever about the differences between journalism, which is thriving and everybody is reading it all over the place, and the business model for newspapers. Thankfully, I'm not going to bore you with that, but the business model for newspapers is changing. So that presents some challenges. We, as a response to that, do things slightly differently, but what we have not done is lower our ambitions. We aim to be as great as we possibly can be. We judge ourselves against the standards of the best, and we will always do that. So therefore, even though we might have a problem in terms of our budgets may not be as high as they were when we started, we still are absolutely committed, for instance, to international coverage. We have our foreign editor, David Pratt, who I'm sure you know, indeed, and
that was our editor who used to work for Al Jazeera, who very highly rates David Pratt.
Well,
and all of what he does.
as do we all. As do we all.
In fact, let's have a proper
Yeah, absolutely. Now, by hook or by crook, we get David to the places he needs to be for eyewitness reports. We're really proud of that, and he's a brilliant journalist. So we don't say, you know what, things are difficult for us, let's just give up, or let's just lower our sights and we'll just do adequate stuff. We don't want to do adequate stuff, we want to do great stuff. And if it takes a more imaginative approach to do that with a lower budget, that's exactly what we're going to do.
You might hear the resound of bottles being recycled in the background, even as we speak, to try to contribute to Davy Pratt's, kind of travel bill. Actually, that's what all that is. It's not, folks. This is exactly Referendum TV, Yeah. But anyway, ever thought of doing anything wacky, like have a TV station, a pop-up TV station, as part of the Sunday Herald?
There's a whole long list of wacky ideas the Sunday Herald has come up with. Saying vote yes wasn't one of them. However, you know what? Doing the newspaper and the website, we do apps, pretty good free apps that we do. We do debates.
Yes,
I've got to say, I mean,
you punch well above your weight.
It's kind of enough. It's kind of enough for me. Thanks very much.
Sorry, I was just a quick question. I'm curious what you think about the actual coverage of the referendum so far. Obviously you've come out for yes, and papers are a wee bit more pro-union, but do you think it's been fair?
Define fair. Newspapers don't need to be fair. Newspapers need to be passionate, need to spark debate. I think it's been, for me, disappointingly uniform, in that, you look at the front pages and there's the same stories. Oil today, oh, geez. I was looking actually when we came out to see how many news outlets made the point that Ian Wood is saying this today, but in his report in February, he said the opposite. Not too many of them did that. Why not? Because clearly it speaks to how much you can trust what he says. I mean, he didn't say that in February. He said that he accepted that there could be 24 billion barrels of oil. He had a whole plan of action to make sure that we got as much of that, got as close to that as possible. He said it would last for 30 years and beyond, and now suddenly it's going to run out in 15 years. Come on.
What's your fracking conspiracy theory?
It's not my theory.
No, the one that
well, I knew so that a few people had pointed out that since that report, his original
In
report in February, his company had actually bought a massive fracking company,
Really?
and now, of course,
This is all the shale oil. This is in England, and we've got none. And apart from all the renewable
and our
energy we've
government has
got.
sort of said it really will not be looking to major on that. So I
Yeah.
think that would
Well,
be
we've
part
got
of the.
all this renewable energy,
We do
which
have that.
seemingly that's where things are going to go in future. We're told yesterday. Maybe that'll change tomorrow.
Well, I mean, but we have seen I think there's massive deposits all across the central part of Scotland, and Loch Lomond is one of the places currently up for licensing. But it did seem like he bought a fracking organisation since his report, and now he's changed his mind suddenly.
Surely that's just coincidence.
Possibly.
Well, who
But
knows
possibly
if
not.
that might find its way into Sunday's paper. But anyway,
Who knows?
you've certainly got a lot to do between now and
Yes,
then.
I have, thank
So
you.
thank you very much for your time,
Thank you.
Richard.
It's a pleasure.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
So now we have Lucy, who's coming in to tell us what's happening on Twitter, and I'm sure that the yes because is probably a large part of all that. So welcome, Lucy. So, Fit's going on.
Yep, we've gone a bit of peace today, going for the yes because. It's still the #1 topic in the UK right now, so absolutely massive, has been for hours. As Alex Massie said, there's been a lot of just entertainment, but more than that, it's been huge. We've had such a variety of different reasons. If we can hear from the brilliantly titled Loch Yes Monster. He or she says Scotland spends 163 million a year on nukes, but children grow up in poverty and pensioners freeze to death. Okay, there's also been some chat about the difference between the rich and poor of the country. Radical Independence has pointed out that the UK's 5 richest families own more wealth than the poorest 12 million people. We can do better than this. Okay, so there's a lot of huge facts in there. It's not just entertainment. And people of my generation, the first kind of generation to benefit from free university, don't want to lose that. Chris says, I'm yes because I benefited from a free education and wish future generations of Scots to have the same. Again, as I mentioned, it's a huge UK topic, so we've also heard from our Welsh group, our Wales for Yes, who say, we also support yes because Scotland has given us so much hope that there's an alternative to simply accepting austerity and poverty for Wales. Yeah, good reaction there.
Yeah.
But I think the main part has been we're getting a lot of human stories. It's not just vague statements. People are thinking about their own day-to-day lives.
You
Gloria...
made fun of me earlier on for that as well.
What?
It's talking about grand concepts. I was like, oh, all in 140 characters. That's
Well,
impressive.
yes, but it is. But it's always a challenge, isn't it, to say something
Yeah.
really meaningful in that small kind of area, especially if it's to do
Yeah.
with your own personal life, is really quite something. So I'm always impressed when people can manage it. So what?
Yeah,
what
well,
have you got?
absolutely. Gloria said, I'm yes because I had a very hard morning with my disabled adult son, and seeing it trending gives me hope for the future again. So we're seeing a lot of optimism there, and it does become more real, more human. It's not talking about oil and currency, it's talking about how it will affect individuals.
I mean, I guess it would have to be said, a lot of people will say that's really creating quite a set of expectations, isn't it, for life after yes. And you'd like to think that the likely government, which would be elected in 2016 or whatever, is listening to what people are really hoping it would happen. To be anything else happening on Twitter apart from that humongous kind of movement there?
Well, that has been the main story. We had a lot of reaction as well to the sort of women's point of view and independence. That got a lot of tweets. I think people are quite, opening up to that idea more and more now. We spoke the other day about the women's vote, if you will, whether it was a fable. But getting a lot of tweets about that.
Okay, well, if anybody wants to keep tweeting away, our hashtag is RefTV. It'll be interesting to see where yes because ends up at the end of the day. I don't suppose you had time to look and see whether no because had crept up at all?
It's not huge. It's not nearly as big as yes because there were a few.
You'd have to say, though, I could remember hearing the theory about different sorts of, campaigns, and it's always more difficult for the campaign that's arguing for the status quo in every situation to appear as vibrant, robust, exciting and romantic. You know, that's not really generally the characteristics of the No campaigns. So I suppose they may not be as upset as that.
I think that's definitely a good point. I think they've also been a bit more lax about promoting. I think the Yes campaign have been more out there. They've been really wanting change. So I think that's reflected in the numbers.
Yeah. Okay, well, do get back in touch with us with anything you want to tweet, because the world will see it. We will too. Thanks very much to me co-host, Stephen, who is sitting kind of smiling beside me with his striking shirt. Tomorrow, what do we have for you? We have the Labour peer, George Fawkes. Yes, indeedy. Oh no, that'll be interesting stuff. We've got Stewart Kirkpatrick, who's head of digital at Yes Scotland, so doubtless he'll have more analytics and all of that, what's been moving today in terms of polls and the Yes Because campaign. Journalist Joyce McMillan will be with us. I'd like to be asking her about the James plays. Anybody been to see them? Yes? You know, you can make a noise. That's one other person. Tremendous ones if you can still catch that about the history of the early Jameses in Scotland. We have Angela O'Hagan of the Scottish Women's Budgetary Group, looking probably more as well about that questions of poverty and how that would change after a yes or no vote. And Helen Marney of electro-pop group Ladytron. So it's all happening tomorrow. Half of the reason that it is because of our sponsor, Sandy Adam, who we'd like to thank once again. So that's all from us here today on Referendum TV.